October 15th, 2023. The Waldorf Astoria, Manhattan. Tony Marconi raised his wineglass and made a joke about the Pope's dead brother that silenced 300 people. Cardinal Vincent Torretti watched from across the room, disgusted but unsurprised. 48 hours later, Marconi's three biggest enemies were dead. Frankie Gallo found floating in the Hudson, his body unmarked but his heart simply stopped. Vincent the Knife Caruso collapsed in his restaurant, bleeding from stigmata-like wounds on his palms. And Paul Romano died in his sleep, speaking Latin prayers he'd never learned. The FBI called it coincidence. The medical examiner called it impossible. But the Vatican's enemies started disappearing into churches, lighting candles, and whispering prayers they hadn't said since childhood. Cardinal Torretti knew better. He'd investigated miracles for 30 years. He knew the difference between divine intervention and elaborate murder. But this time, God himself seemed to be keeping score. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The body of Frankie Gallo bobbed against the pier at Brooklyn Bridge Park like driftwood, arms spread wide in a grotesque crucifixion pose. Detective Ray Castellano crouched beside the waterlogged corpse, his breath visible in the October chill as he studied wounds that shouldn't exist. "No external trauma," the medical examiner called out, pulling off latex gloves stained with Hudson River sludge. Heart just stopped. 28 years old, built like a linebacker, and his ticker quit like he was 90. Castellano's radio crackled. "We got another one. Vincent Caruso collapsed at his restaurant on Mulberry Street. Paramedics are saying it's unusual." By the time Castellano reached Little Italy, the ambulance was already pulling away from Caruso's ristorante, leaving behind a crime scene that made seasoned cops cross themselves. Blood stained the white tablecloth where Caruso had been entertaining his crew, not splattered like violence, but pooled in perfect circles where his palms had pressed against the fabric. "Stigmata," whispered Officer Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything Brooklyn could throw at her, just like the saints. Castellano knelt beside the outline where Caruso had fallen. The blood patterns were wrong, too precise, too purposeful, like someone had painted them there with a steady hand, except 3 witnesses swore Caruso's palms had simply opened up and started bleeding. "Boss," Santos approached with her phone, "you're gonna want to take this call." Cardinal Vincent Torretti's voice carried the weight of authority even through the static. "Detective Castellano? I understand you have some unusual deaths on your hands. How did you—" "I make it my business to know when the impossible starts happening in my city. I'll be at your precinct in an hour." The line went dead before Castellano could ask how a Vatican cardinal had gotten his direct number. 1 hour and 17 minutes later, Torretti walked into the 84th precinct like he owned it. At 62, he moved with the measured confidence of someone who'd spent 3 decades investigating claims of divine intervention, but his sharp eyes still held the cynical edge of his former life as an NYPD detective. 3 deaths in 2 days, Castellano began, spreading crime scene photos across his desk. All connected to Tony Marconi, all impossible. Torretti examined each photograph with the methodical precision of a scientist. Gallo's peaceful expression despite drowning, Caruso's stigmata wounds, perfectly symmetrical, Romano's final moments, captured on his apartment building's security camera, showing him speaking fluent Latin while clutching a rosary he didn't own. "Tell me about the joke," Torretti said quietly. "What joke?" "The one Marconi told at the charity dinner, about Pope Francis's brother." Castellano's confusion was genuine. "How do you know about that?" "Because I was there." Torretti's voice carried decades of weariness. "And because jokes like that don't usually result in divine retribution within 48 hours. The cardinal pulled out a worn leather notebook, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. October 15th, 8:47 p.m. Subject raised his glass and said, "Here's to Pope Francis's dead brother. At least now there's one honest man in the family." The room went silent. 300 witnesses. "You think God is killing people over a bad joke?" "I think," Torretti said, closing the notebook, "that someone wants us to believe God is killing people over a bad joke. The question is why." Castellano leaned back in his chair. You investigate miracles for the Vatican, right? What's your professional opinion? My professional opinion is that real miracles don't come with this much theatrical flair. Divine intervention tends to be subtle. This, he gestured at the photos, this is a message. Someone is making a point. What kind of point? Before Toretti could answer, Santos burst through the door. We got a problem. 4 more of Marconi's crew just walked into St. Patrick's Cathedral. They're barricaded in the confessionals demanding sanctuary. Sanctuary from what? From whatever killed their friends. Santos's voice dropped to a whisper. Boss, they're all carrying rosaries now. These guys haven't seen the inside of a church since their first communion, and now they're praying like their lives depend on it. Toretti stood, straightening his clerical collar. Because they believe their lives do depend on it. Someone has convinced some very dangerous men that God himself is hunting them. And if you're right, if this isn't divine justice, then someone with access to extraordinary resources and intimate knowledge of Catholic theology is using faith as a weapon. Toretti paused at the door. Detective, in my experience, that combination makes for the most dangerous killer of all. As the cardinal disappeared into the corridor, Castellano stared at the crime scene photos scattered across his desk. 3 impossible deaths, a room full of hardened criminals seeking sanctuary. And somewhere in the shadows, someone was orchestrating it all. The phone rang. Another body had been found. This time, it was in a church. Chapter 2. Introduction. The call came at 11:47 p.m., dragging Cardinal Vincent Toretti from the first peaceful hour he'd found in days. He'd been sitting in his study at the diocese residence, nursing a glass of Jameson and rereading his father's old case files, a ritual that had become both comfort and penance since retirement forced him to confront the ghosts he'd spent 30 years avoiding. Your Grace? The voice belonged to Father Miguel Restrepo, night chaplain at St. Bartholomew's. I'm sorry to disturb you, but we have a situation, a body in the sanctuary. The police are requesting you specifically. Toretti set down the whiskey, his eyes lingering on the faded photograph tucked between legal briefs. His father, Anthony Toretti, shaking hands with men whose names had filled newspaper obituaries decades later. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive through Brooklyn's empty streets gave him time to think, something that had become dangerous lately. The Marconi investigation was stirring up sediment he'd hoped would stay buried. Every lead pointed toward connections his own family had helped forge, ties between the church and organized crime that went back generations. His father's voice echoed in memory. Some secrets are too big for one conscience, Vincent. That's why we have institutions. St. Bartholomew's sat like a wounded giant among the tenements, its Gothic spires piercing the October sky. Police cars lined the street, their red and blue lights painting the church's limestone facade in colors that reminded Toretti of stained glass windows, beautiful and ominous. Detective Castellano met him at the door, his usually composed demeanor fractured. Thanks for coming, Cardinal. This one's, he searched for words. It's different from the others. They walked through the nave together, their footsteps echoing off vaulted ceilings that had absorbed a century of prayers. Toretti had performed his first Mass here 40 years ago, back when Father McKenna ran the parish and the neighborhood still believed in redemption. Now the pews held only shadows and the lingering scent of fear. Victim is Paolo Benedetto, Castellano said, consulting his notebook, another one of Marconi's crew. 63 years old, found kneeling at the altar rail at 9 p.m. by Mrs. Chen. She comes in every night to pray the rosary. They approached the crime scene tape, and Toretti felt his chest tighten. Benedetto knelt in perfect genuflection, hands clasped in prayer, face turned toward the crucifix with an expression of absolute serenity. No wounds, no signs of struggle, just death in the posture of devotion. Mrs. Chen said he'd been there for hours, Castellano continued. She assumed he was deep in prayer until she noticed he wasn't breathing. Toretti knelt beside the body, studying Benedetto's weathered face. He'd known this man's type, second-generation Italian-American, probably hadn't been to Mass since his mother's funeral, but still wore his St. Christopher medal and crossed himself when passing a church. Fear had driven him here, seeking protection in the same faith he'd abandoned decades ago. Any security cameras? External only. They show him entering at 4 p.m., but nothing inside the sanctuary. Toretti stood brushing dust from his cassock. 5 hours. He knelt here for 5 hours before dying. The image stirred something in his memory. His own father, in the final stages of cancer, spending entire nights in their parish church, whispering confessions to empty air. Did you tell God in those last hours, Pop? What secrets finally became too heavy to carry? Cardinal? Castellano's voice pulled him back to the present. You recognize him? No, but I know the pattern. Each victim died seeking something: absolution, sanctuary, peace. Someone is using their faith against them. They were interrupted by the arrival of the coroner's van. Toretti watched as the team prepared to remove Benedetto's body, noting how gently they handled the corpse, as if death in a church demanded extra reverence. The sight triggered an unexpected wave of grief, not for Benedetto, whom he'd never met, but for the countless souls who'd knelt in this same spot over the decades, carrying burdens that should never have been theirs to bear. I need to make some calls, Toretti said, already reaching for his phone. This investigation requires resources beyond what either of us can access alone. Vatican resources? Older than that. Toretti's thumb hovered over a contact he hadn't called in 15 years. Sister Catherine Brennan, keeper of the secret archive's most sensitive collections. If anyone could confirm his growing suspicions about the covenant his father had helped negotiate, it would be her. But calling Catherine meant crossing a line. It meant acknowledging that his family's sins might be written in official church documents, preserved in climate-controlled vaults beneath the Vatican. It meant risking everything he'd built to distance himself from his father's legacy. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Your father kept excellent records, Vincent. We should talk. Toretti's blood chilled. Someone was watching him. Someone who knew about the files in his study, the connections he'd been afraid to pursue. Someone who understood exactly what this investigation threatened to expose. The trap was closing, and he was finally beginning to see its true dimensions. Chapter 3. Inciting Incident. Toretti stared at the message until the screen went dark, his reflection ghosting over the words that had just shattered his carefully constructed distance from the past. The phone felt hot in his palm, as if the text had carried some malevolent energy through the digital ether. Around him, the crime scene continued its methodical ballet. Photographers documenting every angle of Benedetto's final prayer. Coroners preparing their silent cargo. Detective Castellano coordinating with patrol units. But for Toretti, the world had narrowed to 13 words that confirmed his worst fear. Someone knew about his father's files. His thumb moved without conscious thought, opening his contacts and scrolling to a number he hadn't dialed in 15 years. Sister Catherine Brennan answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with the alertness of someone accustomed to middle-of-the-night emergencies in service to the church. Vincent, I was wondering when you'd call. The simple acknowledgement hit him like cold water. Catherine, I need to know. Not over the phone. Meet me tomorrow. The usual place. The line went dead before he could respond, leaving him holding a silent device in a sanctuary that suddenly felt less like holy ground and more like a trap. Castellano approached, his expression grim. Problem? Someone's been watching me. They know about... Toretti stopped himself. About what? About files that might not even exist? About a father whose guilt I've spent 3 decades trying to outrun? They know I'm involved in the investigation. Could be Marconi's people, or someone else in his organization trying to figure out what's killing their crew. But Toretti knew it was more than that. The message had been too specific, too intimate. Your father kept excellent records. Not your family or the church, or even you. The distinction was deliberate, personal, crafted by someone who understood exactly which wound would cut deepest. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo, a document in his father's distinctive handwriting, the same careful script that had filled legal briefs and annotated case files. But this wasn't a court filing. The letterhead read Concordia di Sangue in ornate Gothic script, and below it names that made Toretti's stomach clench. Anthony Toretti, attorney. Cardinal Alessandro Torino, Vatican secretary. Vincent the Ghost Marconi, Tony's grandfather. The photograph was cropped to show only a fragment of what appeared to be a much longer document, but even this glimpse revealed enough to confirm what Toretti had hoped was merely paranoid speculation. A formal agreement, signatures, official seals. Another text arrived, St. Francis Cemetery. Your father's grave. 1 hour. Come alone or this goes to the Times. Toretti's hands shook as he pocketed the phone. 40 years of building a reputation based on truth and scientific rigor, and someone was threatening to expose him as the son of a man who'd helped broker deals between the church and the mob. Worse, they were threatening to prove it with documents that appeared genuine. Cardinal? Castellano's voice seemed to come from far away. You look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe I have. Toretti forced himself to focus on the detective's concerned face. I need to go. Emergency at the diocese. At midnight? The church doesn't keep bankers' hours, detective. The lie tasted bitter, but the truth was impossible to explain. How could he tell Castellano that he was being blackmailed with evidence of his family's involvement in the very conspiracy they were investigating? How could he admit that his entire career as the Vatican's miracle investigator might be built on a foundation of blood money and silence? As he walked toward the exit, past Benedetto's body and the crime scene tape, and the assembled machinery of justice, Toretti felt the weight of every choice his father had made settling on his shoulders. The old man had been dead for 5 years, but his sins were apparently still drawing breath, still demanding payment from those he'd left behind. The drive to St. Francis Cemetery passed in a blur of streetlights and second-guessing. Every instinct told him to call the police, to involve Castellano, to treat this as the crime it undoubtedly was. But the photograph of his father's handwriting had triggered something deeper than professional judgment, a bone-deep certainty that whatever agreement Anthony Toretti had helped negotiate was exactly the kind of secret the church had spent centuries learning to bury. The cemetery gates stood open, as if someone had been expecting him. Toretti parked near the entrance and walked the familiar path to his father's grave, his breath visible in the cold air. He'd stood at this same headstone just 2 weeks ago, on the anniversary of the old man's death, wondering what confessions had died with him. Now, apparently, he was about to find out. A figure emerged from behind a nearby mausoleum, elderly, well-dressed, moving with the careful precision of someone accustomed to power. Even in the dim light, Toretti recognized the face from newspaper photographs spanning decades. Anthony the St. Marconi stepped into view, his smile carrying the weight of buried secrets. Hello, Vincent. We have so much to discuss. Chapter 4, Early Development. Toretti's first instinct was to run, not the dignified retreat of a Vatican cardinal, but the primal flight response of a prey animal suddenly face to face with its predator. His legs actually tensed, preparing to carry him back to his car, back to the safety of the diocese, back to the illusion that he could somehow avoid this confrontation. But Anthony Marconi's presence filled the cemetery like fog, making escape feel impossible. The man stood with the patient confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, his expensive overcoat a stark contrast to the weathered headstones surrounding them. He looked nothing like the crude mob boss who had joked about the Pope's dead brother just days ago. Here, in this place of eternal rest, he resembled nothing so much as an undertaker, someone whose business was the careful management of endings. You're making a mistake, Toretti said, his voice steadier than he felt. Whatever you think you know about my father. I don't think, Vincent. I know. Marconi stepped closer to the grave, reading the inscription with theatrical interest. Anthony Michael Toretti. Beloved father and faithful servant. Beautiful words, very carefully chosen. His eyes found Toretti's in the dim light, though I might have added discreet to the list of virtues. Toretti's phone felt heavy in his pocket. He could call Castellano, have the cemetery surrounded in minutes. But the photographs Marconi had sent suggested this wasn't a conversation that would benefit from police involvement. Whatever his father had done, whatever agreements he'd helped negotiate, they were the kind of secrets that destroyed institutions along with individuals. What do you want? The same thing your father wanted. The same thing my grandfather wanted when they shook hands in a room beneath St. Patrick's Cathedral in 1987. Marconi pulled out his own phone, scrolling to another photograph. Peace, understanding, the continuation of an arrangement that has served both our organizations well for over 30 years. The image on Marconi's screen made Toretti's knees weak. His father, looking decades younger but unmistakably himself, seated at a wooden table across from an elderly man who bore a striking resemblance to the Tony Marconi now standing before him. Between them lay documents, and in the background, barely visible in the photograph's shadows, stood a figure in clerical robes. This is blackmail. This is business. Marconi's smile never wavered. Your people have been interfering with mine. Detective Castellano, the forensics teams, all those questions about divine intervention, it's causing anxiety in my organization. People are dying, Marconi. Your people. My people die all the time, Vincent. Usually we handle it ourselves, but these deaths, for the first time, Marconi's composed facade cracked slightly. These deaths are different. They're sending a message, and that message is making my crew nervous. Nervous crews make mistakes. Mistakes attract attention. Toretti studied the mob boss's face, searching for signs of the fear that Castellano had described. But if Marconi was afraid, he hid it well behind decades of practiced control. Still, something in his posture suggested a man under tremendous pressure, someone managing multiple crises simultaneously. So, you're what? Threatening me to make it all go away? I'm reminding you of obligations that predate your Vatican appointment by decades. Marconi pocketed his phone. Your father understood that some arrangements transcend individual conscience. The Concordia di Sangue wasn't just a contract, Vincent. It was a covenant. And covenants bind generations, not just individuals. The words hit Toretti like physical blows. A covenant, not just an agreement or understanding, but something deeper, more permanent. Something that would explain why his father had spent his final years in prayer, seeking absolution for sins that apparently extended beyond his own lifetime. I don't know anything about the protection money, the witness relocations facilitated through church networks, the evidence that disappeared from police custody after convenient conversations between prosecutors and certain cardinals. Marconi's voice remained conversational, but each revelation felt like a nail being driven into Toretti's coffin. Your father was thorough in his record-keeping. Every transaction, every favor, every quid pro quo, all carefully documented. Toretti's mouth went dry. You have his files. Some of them. Others are still in that locked cabinet in your study, behind the first edition Augustines. Beautiful collection, by the way. Your father always did appreciate the church fathers. The casual reference to his private study sent ice through Toretti's veins. Marconi hadn't just been watching him. Someone had been inside his home, photographing his most personal possessions. The violation felt almost as acute as the blackmail itself. The deaths will stop, Marconi continued, when the investigation stops, when Detective Castellano moves on to other cases, when the Vatican's miracle investigator determines that these were tragic but entirely natural deaths, when everyone remembers that some sleeping dogs should stay asleep. And if I refuse? Marconi's smile returned, cold as marble. Then your father's reputation becomes tomorrow's headlines, along with some very detailed documentation about how the church has been laundering money through charity accounts for 3 decades. The trap closed with an almost audible click. Middle development. The silence stretched between them like a funeral shroud. Toretti could hear his own heartbeat, the distant hum of traffic, the whisper of wind through the cemetery's ancient trees. But beneath those sounds lay something else, the weight of 30 years' worth of lies settling onto his shoulders like a lead cassock. How long have you known? The question escaped before he could stop it, revealing more desperation than he'd intended. Marconi's expression softened almost imperceptibly, as if he recognized genuine anguish when he saw it. About you specifically, since you were appointed to the Miracle Investigation Unit, about your father's activities? I grew up knowing. My grandfather spoke of Anthony Toretti the way other men spoke of trusted business partners. Business partners. The phrase made Toretti's stomach churn. All those childhood memories of his father working late into the night, of mysterious phone calls and hushed conversations behind closed doors, of envelopes that appeared and disappeared from the family safe. It hadn't been simple legal work. It had been the administration of corruption on an institutional scale. My father died believing he'd served God faithfully. Maybe he did. Marconi's tone carried an unexpected note of sympathy. The Church has survived for 2 millennia by understanding that purity is a luxury it can't always afford. Your father helped ensure that survival. He protected priests who made mistakes. He facilitated arrangements that kept certain scandals from becoming headlines. He made it possible for the Church to continue its mission without interference from secular authorities who might not understand the complexities of spiritual leadership. Each word felt like another stone added to a cairn marking the death of everything Toretti had believed about his family's legacy. His father hadn't just been complicit in mob activities. He'd been an architect of systematic corruption within the Church itself. How many cover-ups had Anthony Toretti enabled? How many victims had been silenced by legal maneuvers funded with blood money? You're talking about obstruction of justice, conspiracy, RICO violations. I'm talking about survival. Marconi stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Do you have any idea how many scandals your father helped contain? How many priests he quietly relocated before their appetites became public knowledge? How many victims received generous settlements in exchange for signed confidentiality agreements? The Church you've served your entire life exists because men like Anthony Toretti were willing to get their hands dirty. The revelation hit Toretti like a physical blow. Priests with appetites. The euphemism couldn't disguise the horrific reality underneath. His father had helped cover up child abuse, had facilitated the systematic protection of predators in clerical collars, had used his legal expertise to ensure that monsters remained free to hunt among the faithful. Jesus Christ. The words escaped as prayer and curse simultaneously. Indeed. Your father often invoked his name when discussing particularly difficult cases. Marconi's smile returned, but now it carried an edge of cruelty. I have recordings, Vincent. Hours of conversations between your father and various church officials discussing the best ways to handle sensitive situations. Cardinal Torino's voice features prominently, as does Archbishop Benedetti's. They're all quite eloquent about the need to protect the Church's reputation above all other considerations. Toretti's legs felt weak. He reached out to steady himself against his father's headstone, the irony not lost on him that he was literally leaning on the man whose crimes were destroying everything he'd built. The cold marble seemed to burn his palm, as if the stone itself were contaminated by the lies buried beneath it. What happened to the victims? Some were relocated. Others received financial compensation. A few were discouraged from pursuing their claims through more direct means. Marconi's casual tone made the implicit threat even more chilling. Your father was very effective at explaining the potential consequences of making false accusations against holy men. False accusations. Even now, facing the wreckage of his family's reputation, Marconi couldn't bring himself to acknowledge the truth of what had been covered up. But Toretti no longer needed confirmation. The pattern was too clear, too systematic to be anything but deliberate institutional corruption. His phone buzzed with another message. This time it was an audio file, 30 seconds long. Toretti's thumb hovered over the play button, knowing that whatever he heard would make everything worse but unable to resist the terrible gravity of absolute knowledge. His father's voice emerged from the tiny speaker, aged but unmistakable. The boy's family will accept $50,000 and relocation to Portland. Father McKenna will transfer to the Denver Diocese next month. Archbishop Benedetti assures me there will be no further complications. A second voice responded, raspy with age, and if they change their minds? They won't. I've explained the alternatives quite clearly. Toretti's hand shook so violently he nearly dropped the phone. The voice belonged to Vincent Marconi, Tony's grandfather, the original architect of this unholy alliance. But it was his father's calm professionalism, his matter-of-fact discussion of silencing a child's accusations, that shattered something fundamental inside Toretti's chest. Now you understand, Tony Marconi said quietly. The investigation stops, or everyone learns exactly what kind of man raised the Vatican's chief miracle investigator. The trap wasn't just closed, it was welded shut. Torretti stared at the phone's dark screen, his father's voice still echoing in the silence between them. The recording had lasted only 30 seconds, but those words, I've explained the alternatives quite clearly, contained 30 years' worth of lies. Every family dinner where his father had spoken proudly of his church work, every bedtime story about serving God's justice, every moment Torretti had believed himself the son of a righteous man. You bastard. The words emerged as a whisper, directed not at Marconi, but at the headstone beneath his palm. But even as he spoke, another realization crashed over him like a wave of ice water. The voice on the recording, Vincent Marconi's grandfather, had sounded familiar for a reason that had nothing to do with family resemblance. Torretti had heard that raspy tone before, in another context entirely. That's impossible. His head snapped up to meet Tony Marconi's satisfied smile. Your grandfather died in 1989. That recording was made last month. Marconi's eyes glittered with malicious pleasure. October 15th, to be precise, 3 days after Pope Francis announced your appointment to investigate unexplained deaths. The cemetery tilted around Torretti as if the earth itself had shifted. He'd attended Vincent Marconi's funeral 34 years ago, had stood in the back of St. Agnes Cathedral while his father paid respects to a man he'd claimed was merely a client. But if that raspy voice belonged to a dead man... You're hearing things that died with him, Tony continued, his voice carrying a note of genuine reverence. Messages from beyond the grave, you might say. The old man always said our arrangement with the church was blessed by powers greater than either of our organizations. No. Torretti's mind reeled against the implication. He'd spent decades investigating supernatural claims, separating divine intervention from elaborate fraud. But the voice on that recording was unmistakably Vincent Marconi, a man whose corpse had been moldering in Holy Cross Cemetery for over 3 decades. This is impossible. Some kind of voice synthesis, or maybe you're finally witnessing the kind of miracle you've been investigating your whole career. Marconi stepped closer, his proximity somehow making the impossible seem increasingly plausible. Did you really think those deaths were random, Vincent? Gallo with his heart attack at precisely the moment he planned to testify against my organization. Benedetto's stroke just as he prepared to break our confidence. These aren't coincidences. They're reminders that some covenants transcend death itself. The recording had been impossible. Dead men didn't speak, didn't negotiate, didn't threaten families into silence. But Torretti's own investigation had catalogued 3 deaths that defied scientific explanation. Deaths that had saved Tony Marconi's criminal empire from federal prosecution. What if the supernatural elements he'd been trying to rationalize weren't separate from this conspiracy but central to it? My grandfather made a promise, Tony continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, that as long as the church honored our agreement, as long as they protected our interests and maintained their silence, we would be protected by forces beyond human understanding. Your father believed in that promise. He saw the evidence firsthand. What evidence? But even as Torretti asked, he remembered his father's final years, the increased church attendance, the desperate prayers whispered behind closed doors, the way the old man had clutched his rosary during his last illness as if warding off something invisible but terrifying. The first time someone tried to break the covenant. 1994, a young prosecutor named Michael Chen started connecting dots between church charity accounts and certain business activities. Your father tried to handle it through normal channels, legal intimidation, career pressures, the usual tools. But Chen was incorruptible. Torretti remembered the case. Chen had died of a brain aneurysm just days before a major organized crime trial. The death had been so sudden, so medically inexplicable, that it had made national news. His father had attended the funeral, Torretti recalled, and had returned home shaken in ways that years of violent criminal cases had never managed to achieve. Your father watched a dead man reach across 30 years to stop a threat to our family, Tony said quietly. He never doubted the reality of our protection after that. The revelation reframed every conversation Torretti could remember having with his father about faith, about divine justice, about the mysterious ways God's will manifested in the world. Anthony Toretti hadn't been speaking in theological abstractions. He'd been describing witnessed supernatural intervention on behalf of organized crime. "You're insane." But the words carried no conviction. Too many impossible pieces were clicking into place with horrible logic. Tony Marconi's smile carried all the warmth of winter stone. "Insane men don't survive 40 years in my business, Vincent, and they don't forge covenants that bind the living and the dead." The living and the dead. As if summoned by those words, Toretti heard his father's voice again, not from the phone this time, but as a whisper carried on the cemetery wind. "Some promises outlive the men who make them, son. Some debts pass from father to son like original sin." The sound of his own name spoken by a voice 5 years in the grave made Toretti's knees buckle. Everything he'd believed about divine justice, about his family's righteousness, about his own moral foundation, all of it crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to flame. "Now you understand," Tony Marconi said with obvious satisfaction. "This was never about blackmail, Vincent. This was about inheritance." Toretti's hand slipped from the headstone, his palm stinging as if the marble had burned him. The whisper of his father's voice still echoed in his ears, impossible, undeniable, terrifying in its familiarity. He stumbled backward, his vision blurring as 30 years of carefully constructed faith collapsed into rubble. Inheritance. The word tasted like ashes in his mouth. "You're telling me I inherited a supernatural contract with organized crime? Your father understood the weight of it." Tony's voice carried a strange gentleness now, as if he recognized the moment when disbelief finally shattered. "He fought it at first, just like you're fighting it now. But the evidence becomes overwhelming." Around them, the cemetery seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Shadows moved wrong between the headstones, stretching in directions that defied the afternoon sun. The October wind carried voices, whispers in Italian, fragments of conversations from decades past, the soft murmur of prayers spoken by men long dead. Toretti's phone buzzed again, another message from his father's number, but this time it wasn't audio, it was a photograph. Black and white, grainy with age, a young Anthony Toretti standing beside Vincent Marconi in what appeared to be a church basement. Between them lay an ornate document, its parchment covered in elaborate script. Both men had their hands pressed to the paper, and dark stains marked where their palms touched the ancient text. Blood. They had signed it in blood. "The Concordia di Sang," Tony explained, though Toretti hadn't asked. "Drawn up in 1962, when the church was facing some very serious financial difficulties. My grandfather offered a solution: protection money disguised as charitable donations, certain services provided free of charge, and most importantly, absolute silence about activities that might complicate the church's tax-exempt status." Toretti's thumb trembled as he zoomed in on the photograph. His father's young face bore an expression of grim determination, but his eyes held the look of a man who knew he was damning himself and his children. The document between them was covered in symbols that weren't quite Latin, weren't quite Italian, weren't quite anything Toretti recognized despite his theological education. "What language is that?" "Some call it Enochian. Others prefer older names, the tongue of angels, the script of the first covenant. Your grandfather would have known it." Tony stepped closer, his presence somehow making the impossible photograph seem more real. "The church has preserved many things in its archives, Vincent. Not all of them are entirely Christian." The revelation hit like a physical blow. The Vatican Secret Archives, officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2019, though everyone still called them by their older, more ominous name. Toretti had been granted access during his miracle investigations, had seen documents that dated back centuries, but he'd never ventured into the deepest vaults, the sections that required special permission from the Cardinal Secretary of State, the collections that Vatican staff whispered about but never discussed directly. His phone buzzed a third time. This message contained no words, no images, just an audio file labeled St. Agnes Cathedral, October 15, 2023, 11:47 p.m. "Don't," Tony warned, but his tone suggested he knew Toretti would play it anyway. The recording began with the sound of footsteps echoing in a vast space. Then came voices, multiple speakers, their words overlapping in what sounded like a ritualistic chant. But underneath the human voices ran something else entirely, a low, subsonic hum that seemed to vibrate through the phone's speaker and into Toretti's bones. One voice separated itself from the rest, his father's voice, clear and strong, as if recorded yesterday, rather than from beyond the grave. The son bears the father's oath. The covenant passes to the next generation. Vincent Toretti will honor what Anthony Toretti swore, or face the consequences that bind the living and the dead. Other voices joined in, creating a chorus of the deceased: Vincent Marconi's rasp, Cardinal Torino's cultured baritone, Archbishop Benedetti's whispered Italian. All of them dead for years or decades, all of them somehow participating in a ceremony that had taken place just days ago in a church Toretti passed every morning on his way to the Vatican. The recording ended with a sound that made Toretti's blood freeze, his own voice, though he had no memory of speaking the words. "I understand. I accept." Tony Marconi nodded with something approaching sympathy. "You were sleepwalking when you said it. Old covenants have ways of ensuring compliance, even from unwilling participants." The phone slipped from Toretti's numb fingers, clattering against his father's gravestone. Around him, the cemetery had fallen into an unnatural silence, no wind, no distant traffic, no sound except for his own ragged breathing. Even the shadows had stopped moving, as if the entire world were holding its breath. "What do you want from me?" The question emerged as a broken whisper. Tony's smile returned, cold as winter marble. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to recommend that the church close its investigation into unexplained deaths. You're going to declare that divine intervention played no role in recent events. And you're going to ensure that Detective Castellano finds more pressing cases to pursue. And if I refuse, then you'll discover exactly what happens when someone breaks a covenant signed in blood and witnessed by powers older than Christ himself." Toretti stared at his phone lying against the cold marble, his own voice echoing in his memory. "I understand. I accept." Words he couldn't remember speaking, a promise made while unconscious, binding him to a covenant written in blood and witnessed by the dead. No. The word escaped as barely more than breath. Then, stronger, no. "I won't do it." Tony Marconi's expression shifted from satisfied expectation to genuine surprise. "Vincent, you don't understand the forces you're dealing with. This isn't a choice." "It's always a choice." Toretti straightened, drawing strength from 3 decades of faith that ran deeper than his father's sins. "You can threaten me with supernatural consequences, but I've spent my life investigating miracles. I know the difference between divine intervention and elaborate manipulation." The air around them seemed to thicken, shadows stretching unnaturally between the headstones. The temperature dropped until Toretti could see his breath misting in the afternoon air. But instead of fear, he felt a clarity he hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. "Those recordings, they're not messages from the dead." His voice gained strength with each word. "They're psychological warfare, designed to make me believe I'm trapped by forces beyond my control. The timing of those deaths, the apparent supernatural elements, all of it orchestrated to create the illusion of divine protection for your organization. You heard your father's voice." "I heard what you wanted me to hear." Toretti bent to retrieve his phone, his movements steady despite the unnatural cold. Voice synthesis technology, deepfakes, psychological manipulation refined over decades. "The church taught me to look for fraud first, miracles second. You forgot I'm an investigator before I'm a believer." Tony's confident facade cracked slightly. "The covenant is real, Vincent. The blood signature is a piece of historical theater designed to convince my father he was bound by something greater than human corruption." Toretti stepped closer to his father's headstone, pressing his palm against the cold marble. "My father wasn't an evil man. He was a frightened one, convinced by your grandfather's psychological manipulation that he was trapped in a supernatural contract." The wind rose around them, carrying what sounded like whispered threats in dead languages. But Toretti recognized the effect now. Speakers hidden among the monuments, sound equipment designed to create an atmosphere of otherworldly menace. The Marconi family had been perfecting this psychological control for 60 years. The deaths were real, Tony insisted, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Were they? Toretti pulled out his own phone, scrolling through investigative notes he'd compiled over the past weeks. Let me tell you what I've discovered about your divine protection. Gallo died of a heart attack, but toxicology found trace amounts of potassium chloride injected between his toes where the needle mark wouldn't be noticed during a cursory autopsy. Benedetto's stroke was preceded by a brief hospitalization for food poisoning. Plenty of opportunity for someone to induce a cerebral hemorrhage, using methods that wouldn't show up in standard testing. The temperature continued dropping, frost forming on nearby headstones in defiance of the October afternoon. But Toretti pressed on, his investigators' training overriding supernatural theatrics. And the third death, Carmine Rousseau's apartment fire. The fire marshal's report mentions an unusual accelerant pattern, but the investigation was closed before comprehensive testing could be completed. Someone made a phone call, applied pressure through proper channels. Not supernatural intervention, human corruption. You're making a mistake, Tony warned, but his earlier confidence had evaporated entirely. The only mistake was my father's. Toretti turned to face the mob boss fully, no longer intimidated by the theatrical atmosphere or impossible recordings. He believed your grandfather's performance because he wanted to believe, because accepting supernatural bondage was easier than admitting he'd chosen to enable the systematic abuse of children. The shadows between them deepened until Tony Marconi seemed to be standing in a pool of absolute darkness. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of desperate fury. You don't know what you're unleashing. The covenant has protected both our families for 60 years. The covenant is broken. Toretti's declaration rang with absolute finality. Tomorrow morning, I'm submitting my complete investigation to both Vatican authorities and the FBI. Every recording you've played, every threat you've made, every piece of evidence you've shown me, all of it will be analyzed by people who aren't impressed by supernatural theater. The unnatural cold shattered like glass, normal afternoon warmth flooding back into the cemetery. The whispered voices fell silent. The dancing shadows returned to their natural positions. Whatever technological apparatus the Marconi family had installed to create their supernatural atmosphere had been turned off, or had simply lost its power over someone who refused to believe. Tony Marconi stood exposed in ordinary sunlight, looking suddenly older and infinitely more fragile. The aura of supernatural authority had been revealed as nothing more than elaborate stagecraft. You've just signed your death warrant, he said quietly. No, Toretti replied, already walking toward the cemetery gates. I've just reclaimed my soul, resolution. 3 months later, Cardinal Vincent Toretti stood in the same cemetery where his world had collapsed and been rebuilt. November frost painted the headstones silver, and his father's grave lay beneath a blanket of fallen leaves that crunched softly under his knees as he knelt to place fresh flowers, white roses, the same variety his mother had carried at their wedding. The FBI investigation had moved with surprising speed once Toretti's evidence reached the right hands. Detective Maria Castellano, freed from the subtle pressures that had constrained her investigation, had proven relentless in connecting decades of supposedly natural deaths to a sophisticated network of corruption that stretched from Brooklyn social clubs to Vatican bank accounts. Tony the Saint Marconi now occupied a federal holding cell, his theatrical displays of supernatural authority reduced to rambling testimony that made him sound exactly like what he was, an aging criminal desperate to maintain control through elaborate psychological manipulation. The technological apparatus discovered in Calvary Cemetery had been impressive in its sophistication. Hidden speakers among the monuments, electromagnetic field generators designed to create sudden temperature drops, and a computer system loaded with voice synthesis software capable of reproducing any speaker from available recordings. 60 years of refinement had created a convincing illusion of otherworldly intervention, but it was still just that, illusion. Toretti's phone remained mercifully silent, displaying only legitimate messages from living contacts. The Vatican had quietly moved several administrators to different positions, and new oversight procedures now governed charitable donations from sources with complex legal histories. Cardinal Secretary Paroline had accepted Toretti's recommendations without question, though certain archives would require years to fully catalog and investigate. The morning newspapers lay folded in Toretti's coat pocket, their headlines already fading from public memory. Federal prosecutors uncover 60-year conspiracy between organized crime and religious officials. The story would burn bright for a few news cycles before being displaced by fresher scandals, but the institutional changes would endure longer than the public attention span. "You were wrong about some things, Dad," Toretti said quietly, his words forming small clouds in the cold air. "But you were right about the weight of choices, about how decisions echo across generations." He'd submitted his resignation from the office for the investigation of miraculous phenomena the previous week. Not from disillusionment with faith, but from a recognition that his particular talents were needed elsewhere. The Vatican's Financial Information Authority had offered him a position investigating irregularities in church finances, unglamorous work that would never involve claims of divine intervention, but would prevent other families from facing the psychological torment that had nearly destroyed his own. The settlement with the Justice Department had been surprisingly generous. In exchange for his complete cooperation and the return of all misappropriated funds traceable through his father's legal work, Toretti would face no criminal charges related to his family's historical involvement. Clean slate, earned through truth-telling rather than inherited through blood contracts. A figure approached across the frost-covered grass, Detective Castellano, carrying 2 paper coffee cups, and walking with the careful steps of someone navigating uneven ground in professional shoes. "Thought you might need warming up," she said, offering him one of the cups. Steam rose from the opening, carrying the rich scent of actual coffee rather than the institutional brew served in Vatican offices. "Any word on the appeals?" Toretti asked, accepting the cup gratefully. "Denied across the board." Tony's lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity, claimed his client genuinely believed in supernatural protection. Judge wasn't impressed by the insanity defense from someone who'd spent decades running a sophisticated criminal enterprise. They stood in comfortable silence, sipping coffee and watching morning light filter through bare branches. 3 months ago, Toretti had walked away from this cemetery believing he'd reclaimed his soul. Now he understood the reclamation would be a daily process, requiring constant attention to the difference between inherited guilt and chosen responsibility. "You know what the strangest part is?" Castellano said eventually. "Half the old neighborhood actually misses Tony's protection. They'd rather believe in mysterious forces keeping them safe than accept that safety comes from community cooperation and effective law enforcement." "Faith is easier than responsibility," Toretti replied. "My father spent 30 years believing he was trapped by supernatural forces, rather than acknowledging he'd made selfish choices. The Marconi family weaponized that human tendency." A wind rose among the headstones, rustling the fallen leaves but carrying no whispered voices, no threats from beyond the grave. Just the natural sounds of a living world continuing its ancient cycles of death and renewal. Toretti finished his coffee and stood, brushing frost from his knees. Tomorrow he would begin reviewing financial records dating back decades, searching for other instances where fear and superstition had enabled corruption. Unglamorous work, but necessary. The kind of investigation that honored both justice and faith by refusing to conflate the two. "Ready?" Castellano asked. Toretti took one last look at his father's headstone, then followed her toward the cemetery gates, walking steadily into the clear November morning.